So, moving on, I'm going to introduce you to James Higginbotham. This session is called Refining Your API, the last mile of API design. So, James, welcome. We're very happy to have you here. Thank you very much. And if you can introduce yourself, and then the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it. So my name is James Higginbotham, and I'm a consultant. I work with a lot of organizations around the world. I've been helping organizations to help with their strategy, their program execution. I do training. I help organizations understand how to have a repeatable, scalable process for their API design, and I help them to establish, grow, and mature their API programs. I'm also located in Colorado Springs, Colorado, so we have a pretty large mountain right outside our windows here in town. And I'm the author of Principles of Web API Design, Delivering Value with APIs and Microservices. So a lot of what we talk about in API design always comes back to developer experience. We always talk about we want a better developer experience, but we also have a lot of challenges ahead of us. The current climate, the current pressures that we have are forcing us to deliver APIs at a very rapid rate. And sometimes it means that we might have to give up a little bit or make some compromises on some of our developer experience and therefore impacting our user experience. So rather than missing the opportunities to continue to improve our developer experience, today I want to talk about some different ways that we can start thinking about how to refine our API designs without introducing breaking changes, unless we have that opportunity because it's early enough in the life cycle, and still continue to deliver on a great developer experience. The earlier you are in your API lifecycle, if you're in the early stages of design, just like Jose presented previously, then you might be able to absorb a little bit deeper changes in your API, but there's still some things that we can change as well. And a lot of times we measure ourselves up. We look at our API and we say, well, do I have documentation and API design that measures up as well with Stripe? Or maybe we look at Visa as an enterprise IT organization and say, wow, they've really got an amazing catalog of APIs. Or maybe we look at Sabre and their travel logistics and things like that. Maybe we look at Cigna and their healthcare. Maybe we look at other commercial insurance companies and others. And we say, they have these really amazing developer portals. They put a lot of time in their API designs and everything else. They certainly have. But even if you're not deploying your API to a broad audience, and maybe it's just really targeting your internal development teams, maybe you want to share APIs across teams or something, there are some opportunities to make some improvements. So I'm going to talk about 7 different things we can do to refine our API design, even in the face of limited time and resources. The first thing that we should do is always think about APIs like a conversation. We should frame the purpose of an API. What is it meant to do? So to think about APIs as a conversation, there's actually a few different dimensions to that. The first thing that we think about is really kind of machine to machine. And that's where a lot of us spend most of our time. Particularly if we're doing REST APIs, we're thinking about gets and puts and posts and URL paths and response codes and JSON structures. If we're doing GraphQL, we're thinking about the JSON schema, the resource schemas, and the depth and the type of queries we need to support so we can do response shaping and deep fetching and so on. If we're doing RPC, we're thinking about the different functions or methods that we're going to offer over the network. And so we spend a lot of time focusing in on all these technical details, just so that our machines can talk to each other. But there are other important conversations going on that we have to factor into our designs. So if we step back and think about it, we're starting to see now human to machine. As AI is coming in, generative AI, large language models, other opportunities are coming in, we're starting to speak natural language. So we can't just start thinking about paths and JSON structures and so on. We really have to start thinking about what are the interaction models that we're going to have. And in this case, maybe it's more natural language, and we're going to shuttle natural language over our existing API design styles, protocols, and new things that emerge as we go, as we experiment, as this area matures. We also have the developer to developer conversation, and that's where that developer experience comes in that we're always talking about and striving for. have we delivered sufficient documentation to communicate with another developer when we're not talking to them in real time? We're not in the same room. We're not in the same office. We're not even on the same virtual phone call. Instead, we're talking to them through our documentation. And so we have to think about, does our API design and do our documentation artifacts help us to communicate to our developers better? That's where the developer experience really shines and where we need to spend some of our time when we're refining our API design, not necessarily just in that machine to machine side of things, but in the documentation as well. But ultimately, APIs are a conversation between humans. They just happen to use digital channels to conduct them. So in some cases, we have homeowners maybe asking a project manager, what's the status of my remodeling project? Am I over budget, under budget? How are things going? Those are the conversations that the humans are trying to have. And we're using our mobile applications, APIs, databases, cloud infrastructure, everything that we have to make it happen. Likewise, in the insurance industry, you might see something like a policyholder who wants to see their list of recently submitted claims to check on their status. And so we're really having a communication or a conversation with an adjuster, but we're using the digital interface to make that happen. So when we start thinking about all those elements, we need to first step back and think about the conversation and ask ourselves, does my API focus on the conversation, not just machine to machine, but the developer to developer, the human to human, and eventually, most likely human to machine. And so does it focus on the conversation or just the data, just the technical bits, and that's it? We're just focused on the code. That's the first step to refining. Think about the conversations. The next step is to make sure your APIs are intentional. Find the outcome, the problem, and the job to be done. Now, we have a little bit of limited time here in this discussion, but I'm going to give you a brief introduction to jobs to be done. Jobs to be done is the idea that we want to get some empathy with the humans or the users that are going to be using our software. We want to understand what their problem is, what the desired outcome is, and then find the job in the middle that's going to get them from the problem to their desired outcome. Likewise, our APIs can do the same thing. As an example, let's say we're on an e-commerce site. The outcome that I want is I want to confirm the date my order will arrive. Why? I'm uncertain when it's going to arrive. And in fact, I might be going on vacation and may need to ask my neighbor to pick up the box off the front porch for me so that it doesn't sit out in the rain while I'm gone. So what's the job to be done? Viewing the status of an order. So when we think about things in terms of intentionality, what's the intent of the person? So we're having this conversation, well, what's their desired outcome? We can frame it in terms of the outcome, the triggering situation or problem, and the job to be done. And we can pull all those things together in what's called a job story. A job story helps us to put this into a narrative that may look a little familiar to you. When I am certain of when my order will arrive, I want to view the status of my order so I can confirm the date that my order will arrive. So what this allows me to do is to, in a short, rigid form, or not a rigid, short format that allows us to explore the solution and the outcomes, we can now start to understand what our APIs need. Flip that script a little bit and think about, if we start with our code, then we have a rigid situation. We'll say, well, the code only does these certain things. And so therefore, the problem that I have is that I can only support specific kinds of problems and outcomes, or maybe we have a big gap that we have to deliver. How can we make sure that we don't have a gap? We can use acceptance testing. And that's one of the techniques that we oftentimes use when we're building larger systems, products. We have different kinds of enterprise IT systems, and we're trying to make sure that they're delivering on what they need. Well, our job stories can be the input for that. We can compose acceptance tests using those job stories so that we can test, given a certain situation, and we set that up, we can then say, let's perform the job and then verify that the outcome was completed. So now we're not having to force fit some API that we just started coding on right into some sort of business problem. Instead, we can start thinking about the business problem, the conversations, the problems, and the outcomes. So second, number two, we need to think about the intent and what our APIs need to do. So are our APIs delivering on the desired outcomes, or do they only focus on the implementation details, all the different parts and machines and workflows and all the stuff behind the scenes, the data stores and everything else, or are we delivering on outcomes? Are we helping people solve problems? Third, we need to take it one step at a time, and that means mapping processes, not just data. I think our inclination a lot of times in software is to start from the data and work up. And there's nothing wrong with taking a step back and understanding exactly what it is our data has and what possibilities it brings forth. But we also need to step back and think about the processes from the end user. What are they trying to do? Those jobs to be done. What are the steps within those jobs to be done that are going to take someone from a problem to a solution to that desired outcome? We can explore that with a few different techniques. We can use event storming, event modeling. We can just simply use business process engineering and start breaking things into activities and steps and just use more of a tabular view. Whatever it is, use a process that helps you to break down those steps. It's going to give us an idea of what our API needs to do. If we have an API that we've already started building and we want to refine it, sometimes it's helpful to go back, revisit the process flow that we have and see where our API fits, and then find if there's any gaps, if there's anything we need to address in a future release, perhaps, and give that higher priority as we move forward on our roadmap. So ask ourselves, number three, does my API support my operational model? Does it support all the steps in the workflow? Are there gaps missing that I need to address in my API? Fourth, APIs should speak your domain language. So focus on the vocabulary. Oftentimes we get started building and designing APIs and we might use terms interchangeably. So spend a little time modeling your domain area. Look for the resources and the relationships between them. Think about the terminology, what's related to one another. If you have a diagram similar to what I'm showing here, where we have books and carts and cart items and book authors and things, we have a really good blueprint for how we might design a GraphQL schema structure. We might have a really good blueprint for how we design a REST-based API or even a gRPC-based API. So in that case, we need to make sure that we're using the right terminology so that the developers and ultimately the end users will be able to interact with our API successfully. And these resources are going to be part of what you're using to deliver on those outcomes. You can also model your API itself. So if you're just getting started, take some time, and as you're figuring out all those different steps and workflows, start to model those out as operations. Give them names, list books, search books, add item to cart. Give them something that represents the language of your domain. Make sure you're not overloading terminology. If you're mixing books and products or books and items and you catch yourself doing that, unify the vocabulary. It's going to make a great developer experience, and it's going to help focus the developer in delivering the outcomes that those humans need, the end users need, based on all the conversations that need to occur. The result of all this is a domain-specific language. It gives us the operation names. It gives us even the participants, the personas of who's using each of the API operations. So we can start thinking about security, allows us to shift left security and authorization requirements, helps us start thinking about our scopes that we might be enforcing at the machine level. It starts to look at what resources we're interacting with, even what events we might want to emit. And we'll talk a little bit more next about different styles of handling those kinds of events. So ask yourself, does my API reinforce my domain model through a domain specific language and offer up a vocabulary that's consistent and understandable to developers and end users in the domain space that you're in? Number five, design with API consumers in mind. So listen to your consumers regarding the API design style. There are constant debates going on still about, is REST better than GraphQL, is better than gRPC? And I recall the same kinds of debates about Java and .NET and Vim and Emacs and all these different things. And really the answer is always, it depends. But it doesn't depend necessarily on just what you need as the provider. You as the designer need to factor in what your consumer would benefit from. Are they more comfortable using REST or GraphQL? Maybe it's a combination. Are they going to be able to use gRPC? Or are they planning on using your API from a web browser, and therefore you're going to have to map a REST-like interface into a backend gRPC, because sometimes you can't call gRPC from a browser easily. So you have to factor all those things in for that API you're designing when you think all about those different factors. In addition, when we start finding events that our APIs want to model, we need to start thinking about what kind of event streaming options we have. We have webhooks that can make HTTP post callbacks, and we could have different callbacks going between systems. We have server sent events that would allow us to, in a more REST-like way, connect via a GET, perhaps pass in a last event ID or last resource ID of what we've seen, and then start to receive updates pushed from the server. Maybe we want WebSockets where we make an initial connection and an upgrade request over HTTP. And then instead of just having a server push, we can have bidirectional communication using plain text, JSON, binary protocols, whatever it is that makes sense for your API and your consumers. Maybe we're using GraphQL, and subscriptions would be a great way to offer different events and surface those events. Perhaps even gRPC. We have client streaming to the server, we have server streaming to the client, and we have bidirectional streaming that's supported. So when we think about all these different things, we have lots of different options, and we can make a unilateral decision as the designer of the API, or we can factor in what our consumers want. As we're going through our design process, if you did a little bit of modeling up front and came up with your domain specific language, like we talked about before, using the list of operations, events, and so on, by modeling it out as an API profile, you can use that model to transform your API into a REST-based design, a GraphQL, gRPC, or some combination. Maybe you offer REST as a foundational base and GraphQL for being able to do response shaping and more advanced query and fetching capabilities. So ask yourself, does my API consider the needs of my consumers? Sixth, a mock is worth 1,000 words. Fast feedback is really important in the API design process, and there's a couple of different ways to do it. One of the ways is using things like sequence diagrams or the workflow languages coming out from the Open API initiative to map out the different workflows of how our API is going to be used. When you look at an Open API specification document, you're looking at the reference documentation for each operation, but you're not seeing how the operations go together to solve the problems. So going back to the first thing that we talked about, the conversations, what are people really asking and wanting to get done? Let's go to the job stories. What are the problems and the outcomes that they're desiring? And then how does our API take us from the problem to the solution? And can we diagram that out using the operations we've designed? So even if you have an existing API today and maybe you're pretty far in the design process, start to come up with some scenarios, start to diagram them, or better yet, create some README mocks, show the request and response payloads. These kinds of artifacts are powerful to get fast feedback from your API consumers, hopefully even before you started too much of the coding process to where the cost of change is even higher. But even if you are that far along, or if you have an API in production, start to map these things out. Find where the difficult areas are at. Use them to communicate with your consumers to get a better understanding of what kind of enhancement or improvement they're asking from you. So there's different ways to do this using mocks and diagrams and so on to show how our APIs solve problems. So ask yourself, have I explored how my API delivers outcomes by using mocks? All right, seventh and final step, putting it all together. Let's say that we have an API that we need to design now, and maybe we're in the early stages. How do we put all these things into place? How do we get started and do it in a fast and efficient way? What I offer is the ADDR API design process, and it's featured in my book, and I outline it. It is a technique that I've helped a lot of organizations around the world use to go from requirements to an API design with confidence. And you can do it quickly, and you get fast feedback along the way. It enables you to be agile with your API design process. It allows you to work through the process, understanding the big picture by first aligning to make sure you're meeting stakeholder needs, that you're delivering value, and that you have the understanding of what your consumers need and what the business needs. You then go into the define phase and you start modeling what the API needs to do. So you expand it out, you expand out your job stories, you map those into operations. You then figure out what API style or styles you need, and you map that into the style that you want. So build a REST API, GraphQL, whatever it is you're going to do. And then refine, we go in and we build mocks with the designs we've come up with. We put them in front of people, we get feedback, we make adjustments. And just because you're in the middle of an API today doesn't mean you can't jump into one of these phases and start to explore how ADDR can help you improve and refine your API design as you go. Plus, it helps us to think about the conversations. Align helps us to have the human to human conversation. Define helps us to focus deeper into that human to human side. Design is the machine to machine, and refine is the developer to developer. So now we have a way to start incorporating all those different conversations together. All right, so that's the end of my presentation. I've got a QR code and a bit.ly link here. You can grab the slides. There's a link to the book. You can keep up with everything that's going on. There's actually a link to a newsletter that I curate each week as well. So if you want to stay informed of what's going on in the API space, check out this link. And I appreciate your time, and open for any questions we might have with our remaining time.
Thank you so much, James. Very nice, very interesting. I have a question. I don't know, can you provide an example or case study in how these techniques have been used in the past to refine an API design?
Absolutely, yeah. Recently, actually, I was working in the commercial insurance space, and one of the problems they were trying to manage was how do we keep the contact information for all of our brokers and partners up to date? And they had these different systems externally that they were pulling data from, and they wanted to pull it all together. And they started with some code because they already started integrating with those external APIs to pull all the data in. They started designing their API, and then they came to us and said, hey, do you want to look at our API? And so we looked at it and found some opportunities for improvement. So what we did is we encouraged them to step back and start with the job stories. And when they did, they started realizing that what the end users wanted to do with that contact information was way different than the way they were actually designing their API initially. So it caused them to stop when it was low cost to change. They hadn't written any code yet except for the integration, which still needed to be done. So they were addressing that already. But they were able to now start thinking about what does this API need to do to deliver on the problems or that people have day to day, and how is this API going to solve that? And they spent time modeling and designing their API. And when they came back, they had something that they were just excited. They were smiling ear to ear because they knew that they're going to be able to deliver an API that people were going to use, that they weren't going to have to go back and scrap a bunch of code and start all over. They had an API with a target that they could start to aim toward and iteratively work toward. And they could make adjustments because they had put enough thought in there that if they get feedback, they can make quick adjustments. And they're able to put that design in front of the initial consumers who are going to be integrating that data, and that helped them as well. So that was absolutely huge.
Fantastic. Many of the recommendations from your talk are part of the ADDR API design process. So who would benefit from using this process?
I've seen this work for a number of different organizations. I've worked with organizations that are more software as a service, kind of mid-sized, small-sized software as a service, and they're perhaps have a web interface, mobile interface, and they have a mobile API. Now they're looking at externalizing a partner API, or they're trying to formalize their API for their end users. It works well there. I've also used it inside the enterprise. So a lot of enterprises have many teams across many different areas. Sometimes they're still under the digital transformation process. They're trying to break down the silos that they have. Whatever that case is, it actually scales all the way up. So it's very lightweight, very simple. It just guides you through a process so that you're not kind of scratching your head trying to figure out, okay, somebody asked me to build an API, what do I do? Or, I have these wireframes, how do I design an API to support that? It gives you a step-by-step process to be able to apply. And you can always, because it's a framework, swap some things out if there's some things you want to change. But it does scale up. In fact, I have one client that I've rolled this out to. They have 10,000 developers and about 2,500 Scrum teams. And so they use that across all the teams to varying degrees. So if they're building a product that's externally facing, they'll start with job stories and work all the way through. If they're just designing a service, they might jump in and just say, let's map out the business processes, get that API model done, and then start designing and implementing. So it can be used at different tiers, different levels, and it can also be used at different size organizations, small and large. And it's really what I've found is a really easy to approach process that's repeatable and teachable, so that teams can continue to do ADDR across and within the same team. So the same team can use it for multiple APIs, and you can spread it out across multiple teams, and everybody's kind of talking the same language and looking at the same kind of design artifacts as they go.
Perfect. So James, thank you so much. It was quite interesting, enlightening, this talk. Nice presentation. So
Great.
thank you, and hope to see you next year back.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
And
Appreciate it.
thanks to you. Take